This time on Poll Hub, the 2024 election could be historic in a lot of ways. But this time we're talking about one specific thing, the gender gap. Our polling right now is showing the biggest difference we've ever seen between how men and women may vote in the presidential election. What is going on? We're going to discuss that. Then, what do you think of ditching summer vacation and having kids in school year-round? Now, this isn't a new idea, but it is gaining a bit of traction in a few states. And so we're asking the question, is this a blast from the past or a wave of the future? And we finish with our third spooky fun fact of the Halloween season. Boo! Let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Neil Viswanathan.
I'm Hunter Petro.
And I am Lee Marigoff.
So we're talking about the gender gap, and it's interesting because this is something we've been talking about internally, Lee and Mary, for a while. But Neil, who is one of our student producers, brought this and said, hey, I'm really interested in this topic. And he was interested from the standpoint of the gender gap in terms of not what we're seeing in our polls necessarily, but registration advantage and then turnout. So there's a lot going on here, but let's start with this, what we're seeing in our polls, because Lee, you've talked about this even in some of your YouTube analysis that you've done of our state polls that we've been doing. Historically, the gender gap has been getting bigger. The gender gap, again, is the difference between how men say or do vote in a presidential election and how women vote in terms of the candidates. So if men vote more for a Republican, women vote more for a Democrat, which is typically the way, that gap, the difference between that is called the gender gap. In 2008, it was 12 percentage points. In 2012, it was 18 percentage points. In 2016, it was 24 percentage points. It was 23 percentage points. So basically the same in 2020. Our latest poll this month nationally found a 34-point gender gap between the nominees. Let's talk about that. Lee, you've talked a lot about this gender gap we're seeing. What's going on, and does it mean something? Or is it real? I mean, what's going on?
Well, I think it may not be, first of all, it's real. It may not be precisely that high in the end because both campaigns understand this is an important thing. Recognizing when you're talking about a gender gap, as you indicated, it goes both ways. So that if you have women who are, let's say, registering more and they're also turning out more and they're more prone to vote for Kamala Harris for a variety of reasons, not the least of which she would be the first woman president, that can create a gap among the women. But also, Donald Trump's appeal may also be more pronounced with men than women, and therefore that can create a gap there. So we often think of the gender gap as, it's referenced also like as a positive thing for a Democrat. And in this case, her support among women is greater than Trump's support among men. So yes, it is benefiting her more than Trump, but there is a other side to the coin, and that is that there are more men who are more likely to vote for Donald Trump than they are for Kamala Harris. So whether this is going to be the picture in the end, both sides know that they have a vulnerability. And Harris camp has been really focusing more on how do I get some more men supporting my candidacy, and Trump is doing just the opposite, feeling he has his base secure, but can he get some more women in his corner? So it's an interesting phenomenon in our politics, and historically kind of interesting also, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to look at it from not only the female perspective, but also the male perspective. But I was wondering, what do you think, besides Roe v. Wade, could be causing this gender gap? Because I feel like Roe v. Wade is the big thing that people talk about that's causing this, but do you think there are other factors that are contributing to this?
I would indicate that Roe v. Wade is a big deal because that is built on an already existing difference. We've seen this for many decades in our politics. So there is that difference. And then women's issues have affected the dialogue. We've seen it in all the referenda that have occurred. It's on the ballot in 10 states this time. That will galvanize a reaction to, beyond the fact, as I indicated before, that Kamala Harris would be the first woman president. That is built on, incidentally, something she's not campaigning on, which I find interesting. She's not saying, if you elect me, I will be the first woman president. That's kind of an interesting dynamic. So she's running on the issues that are more prominent for people, and certainly Roe v. Wade is one of those.
So I do want to take a look at the gender gap in terms of voter turnout, but I do want to pick up on a couple things, Lee, that you mentioned, which is one about issues. We talk about the gender gap, we focus on just that, men versus women. But at the same time, I mean, there are other things that are going on in the discussion. Issues, how are they resonating rather? Some are specific to women, but some are specific more so generally. And secondly, from a personal standpoint, I mean, I grew up in the era of Geraldine Ferraro and then Hillary Clinton coming onto the scene, and now Kamala Harris. But when you look at that gender gap and how the gender gap has widened from what we've been seeing in terms of the elections, I mean, Hillary Clinton, the gender gap was growing, but it certainly isn't at the point where it is now with the Harris-Trump campaign. So I think that we need to, yes, focus on gender, but at the same time recognize that there are other dynamics under the hood, Lee, as you like to say when we talk about election results and the campaigns. Let's take a look at turnout. So when we look at the statistics historically, women have turned out at a slightly higher rate than men. 1980, in fact, was the last time when voter turnout was equal between the two genders. And looking back to about 2016, Black voters actually had the highest gender gap in voter turnout at 10%, with Asian voters having the lowest gap at 1%. Jay, what do you make of that?
Yeah, it's interesting when you break down the differences across racial lines too, that there are differences there. I think what's interesting about turnout is how consistent it's been. You mentioned 1980. That was a long time ago, right? So it's been that long that women have been turning out in higher numbers. And remember, women are a larger portion of the population as well. So there's kind of a doubling effect there. And I think that helps at least explain a little bit why so often when we talk about, Lee, for instance, we talk about who are the swing voters. It's almost always women. It's soccer moms, it's the suburban moms. It's almost always women that we're talking about when we're talking about those swing voters. And I think that's part of the reason why they participate more, even in a marginal way, more in the democracy than men do.
Yeah, and I think that's what we've seen. Then the question is, looking in on this particular election, I think it's kind of interesting to see that some of the debate is over how are Black men and Latino men, are they less prone to be Democratic this time? And as Donald Trump, as a Republican, made some inroads, which he seems to definitely made with those groups, and that will only exacerbate the gender gap that we're talking about. One of the things we're going to be looking at election night, which is really important, though, building off of all this, is what share of the vote is female, what share of the vote is male, recognizing, as you indicated, both in all, that Democrats will intend to be more democratic, and if they are a larger share than even they typically are, and that presumably would help the Harris effort. And if they aren't, if they just come in their normal higher numbers, that would be a sign that Donald Trump perhaps is going to carry the day in the end after all of this going on. I do recall, Mary, you talked about Hillary Clinton when Geraldine Ferraro was the vice presidential candidate in 84. It didn't have much bearing at all, clearly. The ticket lost all but one state. When Hillary Clinton was running, she was known and not as favorably as Kamala Harris is. So there was a lot of people saying by the end of that campaign, I certainly would vote for one for president, just not Hillary Clinton. Okay, the question is, has that time come or not? And in a couple of weeks, we will have that answer. And so it'll be a fascinating election to be watching.
Do you think that there's any Republican woman that could possibly appeal this gender gap, like Nikki Haley, Tulsi Gabbard, or I feel like gaining a lot of steam? Do you think that it has to be a Democratic woman to open this gender gap, or?
Remember, Tulsi Gabbard is nominally still a Democrat. Remember that, by the way.
Oh, okay.
But Nikki Haley is a fascinating figure in all this, because I think a lot of people thought that it would be a Republican who would break the glass ceiling once and for all, and that would be a Republican woman to do that. And I think right now the question would be, what if Nikki Haley was running against Joe Biden, and what would that mean for the contest and for the gender gap? And I think you know where I'm going with this. I think you would have seen exactly what you're suggesting, that the Republican woman might have been in really good shape right now, better than the matchup we're currently seeing between Trump and Harris.
And Neil, that it just made me completely think about something entirely different. In countries around the world where they've had their first elected female leader, they've mainly, or in many cases, been conservative. Margaret Thatcher in Britain, in Mexico, they now have the first female leading the country from a marginally conservative party. It's a little different in Mexico. So, and in Italy, right? Italy has a very conservative woman who's prime minister. First time they've had a female prime minister. So it's interesting to think about it that way. I hadn't thought about it internationally where this has happened, but I think you may be onto something there, that the expectation was that the Republicans would do it first, and they still may. We don't know what's going to happen in November, but breaking that ceiling may be easier for a more conservative party, or at least historically it has been in some other countries.
So the gender gap really started to open up around 1980. What do you think specifically around that time period contributed to this? I know like Reagan, people think Reagan had a lot of charisma. He had a lot of national pull, as you can see with like the electoral map. Do you think it was just Reagan's pull specifically that brought women out to vote at higher rates, or do you think it was something else?
I would go with issues generally. That was a era where the Cold War was still very dominant in people's minds, and I think that more aggressive military stance was more compatible with male support. And I think women were getting into issues of pay equity, issues of child raising and Head Start and daycare and equal pay for equal work and all those kinds of things. And that seemed to live more comfortably with Democratic voters. And so I think that's what was going on in the 80s. The numbers were, as you suggest, not as pronounced as they are now. But this is certainly a time where one can easily imagine a record breaking gender gap. Anything over mid 20s and up would be something that would be unprecedented.
Well, and also, Neil, just remember the other day when we were meeting with you and some of your fellow students, and we talked about the idea of the personal connection, that how people are motivated to, the voters are motivated to go to to cast a ballot or to get involved when there's something that resonates personally with them. I mean, think about it this way. I think it was in the mid 1970s when women had the right to be able to open up their own credit card or get their own credit card. So now you see the idea that as you approach the 1980s, now there are economic issues that women personally and independently are facing. And as Lee pointed out in the 1980s, harkening back to when I was younger, or movies, old movies, that you might see of women in the workplace, in the middle of Manhattan, going off to work and leaving their families and their children behind, or with daycare. As Lee pointed out, it became very relevant. And so, as we talked about the other day, when there's a relevant issue, people tend to be more engaged and more motivated.
And maybe this time that issue, as you said, Neil, at the very start, is abortion. That actually may be, at the end of the day. We have a lot to unpack after this election is over and we look at the exit poll data and everything. We have a lot to unpack, and we'll see if this gender gap that we're seeing in this polling, if it holds on election day.
So, as our listeners know, I am a mom of 3 kids and constantly thinking about schedules and breaks and how to balance it all, as I think a lot of parents can relate to. But one thing that we on the Poll Hub team have been discussing is the idea of getting rid of summer breaks altogether now that we're back in full swing of the school year. So, what if schools ran year round? It's definitely been a topic of discussion for decades, but how do Americans feel about it these days?
Well, it's a loaded question. Let's take a look at some of the history before we jump in, because back in the early parts of the 20th century, rural kids went to school in the winter and the summer. Their breaks were in the spring and the fall because they needed to work on the farms they lived on. Meanwhile, city kids had pretty close to a year-round schooling, although their attendance was often pretty sporadic.
So let's start at the beginning. What exactly is year round schooling? Well, the National Association for Year Round Education defines it as a calendar that has no break for longer than 8 weeks. It's not as though year round schooling doesn't exist. Some school in nearly a dozen states have year round calendars. Mississippi has also seen some movement in this direction, with 29 of 137 districts adopting a modified year round calendar for the 2023-2024 school year. Usually, these modified schedules include 9 weeks of school, followed by a short break. But are Americans really on board with this idea?
Well, Gallup partnered with Phi Delta Kappa in 2002 to gauge Americans' interest in the idea. They found only 29% of Americans want to increase the length of the school day, while 40% favor a longer school year. Then there's a question about those lazy days of summer. Nearly half of K through 12 parents, about 48%, wish their kids could have taken part in more summer programs, according to a July 2024 Gallup poll. Around the rest of the world, year round schooling is pretty common. Many schools in Western Europe operate on a pretty similar model. They don't actually go year round. Instead, they spread out the same number of school days across the year, breaking them into segments with multiple vacations.
Let's take a closer look at implementation. When the Coastal Business Journal surveyed South Carolina parents in May 2005, they found that 72% preferred the traditional school calendar with summers off. But more recently in Nashville, they surveyed district parents about their preferences for the school calendar for the 2024-2025 school year. Out of 1,211 votes, 56% favored a hybrid year-round calendar.
With all of that, we're going to bring in someone who might have a little bit more context on the situation. Dr. Carol Rinke is a professor of education here at Marist College. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, just jumping right in, what do you think is driving this rising interest in a year round schooling model? Is it logistics? Is it cultural, maybe financial factors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that we're probably looking at a confluence of factors. Like you said in the beginning, I think there's a history of our current calendar coming from both kind of our agricultural roots in terms of our educational history, also a standardized approach to schooling that emerged about a century ago. And we're at an interesting time in educational history right now because we are coming out of the COVID pandemic and we're coming out of a period of time where lots of different models and lots of different approaches were utilized. And so I think there's probably a new openness in the educational system to think about what different models of schooling might look like.
So, Dr. Rick, what are the pros and cons of this year-round model? I was talking with a fellow parent yesterday about being back into school for a month or so and saying, what happened to the carefree days of summer with all the work and all the scheduling that our children are facing and as we as parents are facing? So what are the benefits and what are perhaps some of the downsides?
Yeah, and I'm a parent as well. So I have one in high school, one that's, off to college. But I think the clearest benefit is going to be a reduction in learning loss over the summer. So there's really clear evidence that when students are not in school for an extended period of time, there is loss to their educational attainment. So depending on which study you look at and depending on which kind of assessment is used, there's mixed results whether as to whether it's a slight learning loss or more significant, but it is pretty clear that students do lose educational attainment over the summer.
You mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic, and so has there been more of an emphasis placed on year-round schooling given the education loss that we experienced during that period?
Yeah, so COVID also gave us some really interesting outcomes in terms of learning loss. So we saw a decline in reading scores and an even larger decline in math scores during the COVID pandemic. A large proportion of funding that has been used to kind of remediate some of that loss has gone to summer programming. So there really was an attempt to accelerate learning to kind of remediate from this loss by focusing on summer learning.
And taking a look at a more targeted question, do you see this being more beneficial or causing more concern for families of lower income?
That's a great question. I think that one thing that's really clear is that lower income students need access to high quality enrichment programs year round. And some evidence does show that there are, greater learning loss in the summer, greater learning loss through the pandemic for lower income students. So I think there could be some real benefits to expanding the school year and also looking at maybe an expanded school day for lower income students. A lot of districts have taken that approach as well. But another thing to think about is there is some lost income potential for older students. So for high school students that use the summer to, for their own employment and to supplement family income, year-round school could actually interfere with that.
There was a statistic that we looked at, and it showed the Nashville survey had about a 56% support for year-round schooling, while the South Carolina parents preferred the traditional summers off. And don't get me wrong, there was about a 10 to 15 year difference in between when those two surveys were done. And obviously COVID happened in between those. Do you think there's any regional differences that also impact this year-round schooling model?
That's a good question. I don't know if there are regional differences, but I would say that there's no real standardized approach to year-round schooling right now.
Mhm.
So although in general year-round schooling, includes kind of these 8 to 9 week sessions and then brief intersessions. The approach to doing it can be really different. There's single track as well as multi-track year-round schooling. So single track would be where students are enrolled in school along the same schedule, whereas multi-track would be where different groups of students stagger so that the building is in continual use. And actually, it seems like the multi-track is a lower cost alternative, but it has poorer outcomes for students. So some of it might have to do with the particular approach that's being taken by the district. And some of these approaches are cost neutral, whereas others do cost more money and others include cost savings. So really the particular approach that's being proposed by the district, I think does matter.
Yeah. This single track and multi-track is very interesting to me because I haven't heard a lot about it, but when we were doing all the research on it, I realized that these were clearly the two different models that seem to be the go-to for this year-round schooling. As you mentioned, there is a little bit of an economic factor here. Do you think socially that impacts students, that more harms the students to be on a multi-track where, they're more staggered in their schooling, they don't see as many kids? Socially for students, which do you think is more beneficial?
I think there could be differences in social interaction, but I think there's also an important difference in kind of family interaction. So I
Right.
think some of the goal here is to relieve stress on families and working parents, low income families, everybody that's trying to juggle the demands of schooling and other enrichment opportunities. I think we all know the Surgeon General recently put out an advisory about high stress for parents, 48% of parents indicating that their stress is overwhelming. And so I think some of these multi-track approaches, if they're not consistent from sibling to sibling or even among, larger families and communities, that could actually increase stress rather than lower it on families.
What about burnout, Dr. Rink, among students, by not giving them perhaps as long of a break as they're used to? Is there evidence that students seem to suffer more from burnout with year-round schooling?
I don't know if there is evidence for that, but I would actually wonder if the intersessions could be beneficial in terms of both student and teacher burnout. I think teacher burnout is also an area for consideration, just in terms of spacing out those breaks so that they're a little bit more dispersed around the year.
Well, Dr. Carol Rink, we appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the conversation.
All right, continue on the Halloween theme here as Halloween gets nearer. As I never miss Halloween because I always know election day is right afterwards. They are connected, folks. But we have a question from a merit poll that was done in 1983. And the question was, during Halloween night, when youngsters come to your door, which of the following treats are you most likely to give out? Candy, money, fruit or food, or nothing at all? Bah humbug to you. That's a mixed metaphor. Anyway, candy got 68%, money was 12%, fruit or food was, I believe, 9%. The numbers are getting very small. And nothing at all was also 9%. And I would only say, if I was going out there, I would want candy or money, probably in that order, which is the way the numbers are showing. I don't trick or treat anymore. We don't get a lot of kids to the house either, so it's not.
What
really
did
up
what
here.
did you get when you trick or treated though?
I would say?
Did you
mostly
ever get
candy.
money?
Occasionally, a handful of coins would descend, which was okay because you could convert that into candy. But candy was what I think for me was what it's all about. How about you folks?
We have a very busy block. I always give out candy. That's certainly my children's preference, mine as well. When I was younger, yes, I did get some coins. But, I wonder about the, fruit. No, I would never give out food. I mean, are people giving out like leftover turkey legs from dinner? When they run out of candy, I,
Do you like some mac and cheese, kid?
yeah, right? But the other thing, that we've started moving toward as well is giving out non-candy and non-food treats because there are a lot of children who have food allergies, peanut allergies, who are, gluten intolerance, those types
Oh,
of things. So
yeah.
I tend to also give out stickers, little toys, maybe some pencils, Halloween pencils, things that kids like, but, other children rather who can't have certain candies don't need to feel excluded. I
Do the
always
kids
let the
tell
kids
you
pick.
that? I'm just curious. Do they say at the door, "I can't have candy"? Do you have something else, or how do you
Well,
know?
I do have other things available. I sometimes when we take our kids trick or treating, we leave baskets of candy and also baskets of other treats. And I also offer, would you prefer something else?
Hmm.
And a lot of kids will take, whether it be a sticker or a pencil. Some kids actually just like the toys as opposed to
Yeah,
the candy.
that's
Not
it.
me.
I-
I'm a candy person.
No, I think that's a good idea, though. It's a little difference on the theme there. We'll change on the theme. Yeah, Jay, what are you?
Don't
gonna
you
say?
ever do you ever have any wise guy kids like give me a 5, give me a 20, something like that? No.
They just take handfuls of
You live.
candy.
I mean, you live in New York City, so it's
I
like,
live in New
I
York
mean, I
City.
can't believe that some kid doesn't come to the door and go, give me a $5. Come on.
It's
Go
not an
fu-
open-ended question, Jay. It's a closed-ended question. Candy or treat or a toy?
GoFundMe for Halloween. It's a whole new concept in that. So, Mary, I'd like to know something. So, your kids go out trick or
Yes.
treating and they get whatever they get in the bags. Now, when they get home, does one of them eat a lot quicker and the other saves it and then plays a real negotiation at the end for the
Is
bag
that what
that
you and
you
your
already
brother did? Is that where we're going? Is you
I
and your
think
brother
there
That
may
did?
have been
sounds like
some of
it.
it. It was one of my friends when I went out trick or treating.
Oh.
There was the notion of eating it quickly on that night, getting nice and really full of sugar high, and then seeing if you could negotiate the next day for whatever you did eat that night.
I will put it to you this way. It reaches a certain point where they don't have the option of eating it. It's sort of the candy gets moved away, to a table or to a cabinet. So because they're already on enough of a sugar rush. But Jay, you haven't weighed in terms of your
I never
Halloween
got anything
treats.
but candy. I mean, I don't, the fruit thing, I mean, I was a kid in the 60s and the danger of, stuff happening, people doing dangerous things. And I sure it did happen. I guess it wasn't real. There were real news reports about bad things happening. So not only candy had to be packaged. Like if
Yep.
somebody dropped in something like hard candy, not that you wanted hard candy sticking in your bag, but it had to be packaged. So I never got money. I never heard of that actually. And I would have liked that, I think. And fruit, no, I never got that. So I mean, that's what surprised me about this poll is that it wasn't 100% candy. I mean, I would have gone with, I would have thought the poll would have been like 99% candy and 1% I'm not paying attention. I don't know.
For a couple of years, I used to get an egg deposited on my windshield at the end of the night,
That's
which
different.
I didn't find to be all that humorous, saying that we were giving stuff and were treating and did not deserve the trick as well. So there was some hostility on my part towards that.
Was it a Marist student
No, this was
way back in the day?
No, would not have occurred. Grades would have been adversely affected. Now, this would not have occurred. But I'm so looking forward to next week, because these have been on a theme and we've been on a roll here. And I just have no idea what is in store for next week as we get closer to the day itself.
That'll do it for Poll Hut this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Hunter Petro and Neil Viswanathan.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.